These are the 1986 to 87 GMC RTSs. The RTS-06s are the private bus lines. Now, like the RTS-04s, they too were ordered for the NYC DOT for local and occasional express bus service, and the private bus lines embraced the RTS-06s as they did earlier with the 1979 GMC RTS-03s and the 1984 to 85 GMC RTS-04s for the Queens private bus lines. And in 1986 to 87, the NYC DOT helped the private bus lines purchase 170 RTS-06s for the Queens and Brooklyn private bus lines, with 73 being T8J206 models and 97 being T8J606 models. Like the previous order of RTS-04s, the T8J606 models were a bit of a rarity in New York City as they were 96 inches wide, while New York City Transit as well as the other Queens private bus lines only ran the standard 102-inch wide RTSs. So, without further ado, let's go through the list of private bus lines and fleet numbers of these RTS-06s. Here we go! So 716 to 740, along with 761 to 763, were delivered to Triborough Coach, and were painted in red and white, while some later got the red and gray Lightning Bolt. Now, Triborough Coach had the largest and most diverse fleet of GMC RTS-06s, with 28 units in total. Triborough Coach also received 7 1987 methanol-powered RTSs, and they were numbered as M1 to M6. Now, these units were acquired to determine which type of alternative fuels might be suitable for New York City Transit buses, but unfortunately, it was proven to be not as reliable as diesel or CNG. Anyway, 43 to 54 were delivered to Steinway Transit, and were painted in orange and white, while 244 to 258, along with 270 to 274, were delivered to Queens Transit Corp, and were also painted in orange and white. Steinway and Queens Transit later merged into Queens Surface Corp in 1988. Anywho, 395 to 420 were delivered to Command Bus Company, and were painted in green and yellow, while 551 to 567 were delivered to Jamaica Bus, and were painted in tan and brown. Then were later given the maroon, tan, and brown scheme. But last but not least, 601 to 622 were delivered to Green Bus Lines, and were painted in green, of course. Now 601 to 606 were originally built for Jamaica Bus, and were originally numbered as 568 to 573. Command RTSs 395 to 416 were later given to Jamaica Bus, and were numbered as 571 to 580, while 419 to 405 were later given to Green Bus Lines, and were numbered as 640 to 652. Triborough Coach methanol-powered RTSs M1 to M6 were later converted to diesel, and M3 was given to Jamaica Bus and was numbered as 3701, while M5 to M6 were given to Green Lines and were numbered as 654 to 653, while M1, M2, and M4 were subsequently retired. So these RTSs were pretty interesting to say the least. Like their fellow cousins at New York City Transit and their older sisters from the 1984 to 85 order, they featured push-type rear doors and also had some differences, such as roll signs as opposed to flip dots, as well as no rear destination signs, as well as all the windows being openable, as well as the lack of hoodlum lights in the overall interior configuration. And they also featured amber rectangular reflectors above the headlights, as seen in this photo of Triborough Coach's 722. And these GMC RTSs signify the use of the Detroit Diesel 6V92 engine, which sounds like this. I have so many memories of these RTSs, from Green Line's Queen Surface Corp, Jamaica and Command mostly, even though I didn't get a chance to ride the Triborough coach units, but I do remember seeing them along the way. So as for these GMC RTS 06s, like their sisters from 1984 to 85, they were overall good buses and served the private bus lines very well, with the exception of some nitpicks from passengers and drivers, and of course mechanics, but hey, what can you do? What I liked about these RTSs was their overall configuration and different color liveries, compared to their cousins at New York City Transit. And coming from somebody who grew up in Manhattan, I always look forward to seeing these in Queens and Brooklyn, and of course Lower Manhattan. And honestly, I miss the diversity and the colors of the private bus lines, and I'm sure a lot of us do. Now as for my personal favorites, it's hard to choose, but I have to say the methanol units along with the narrow-body T8J206 RTSs really stood out the most. But out of all of them, 3701 was my favorite. When MTA Bus took over the private bus lines, 71% of these RTSs were retained and renumbered, and by 2006, roughly 94 GMC RTS 06s remained in service. So, here's a list of RTS 06s that were renumbered. So 1137 to 1139, along with 1151 to 1163, with the inclusion of 1200, were ex-Jamaica units. 4269, along with 4284 to 4296, along with 4298 to 4299, with the inclusion of 8582, along with 5858 to 5877, along with 5878 to 5879, were ex-Green Line units. Well, last but not least, 7095 to 7121 were ex-Triborough coach units. Unfortunately, the Queen Surface Corp units were the first to be retired several years earlier. Therefore, they did not survive the takeover. Many were scrapped, while some were sold to Lafayette and Greenville Bus in Jersey City. It is sad to say that these RTSs are now retired, and unfortunately, none were lucky enough to be saved or preserved. Though I wish they would have preserved one of the narrow-bodied T8J606 models, or one of the former methanol-powered RTSs like 3701, but it is what it is. Oh, and before I forget, 1162 was the sole unit to be fully repainted in the MTA scheme. It was supposed to be saved, but unfortunately it did not materialize, and it was subsequently scrapped. And 1141 was burnt after the infamous fire at LaGuardia Depot, and 2 was subsequently scrapped. So as for these GMC RTS 06s, they're gone, but definitely not forgotten. So with that being said, this is Kal-El saying stay safe, stay well, and of course thanking you guys for watching.